Steve Harvey had heard husbands describe their marriages in a lot of ways: complicated, expensive, still under negotiation. And every once in a while, some brave man would look straight into the camera and say perfect. Usually, Steve laughed. Sometimes the wife laughed harder. But when 61-year-old Harold Bennett said it, his wife didn't laugh at all. The Bennetts had been married 37 years. Harold stood at the Family Feud podium in a navy blue shirt, one hand resting comfortably near the buzzer. His wife, Denise, stood beside him in a burgundy dress. Their two adult daughters and Denise's younger sister completed the family lineup. Steve had been making small talk before the next round. He looked at Harold. 37 years? Harold smiled proudly. Yes, sir, Steve nodded. That's a long time. The audience applauded. Then Steve glanced at Denise. You still like him? The crowd laughed. Denise smiled politely. I love him. Steve caught the wording. He looked at her. I asked if you like him. The audience laughed again. Denise gave a small shrug. That depends on the day. Harold laughed louder than anybody. Steve smiled. Then he turned back to Harold. All right, man, 37 years. How's the marriage? Harold didn't hesitate. Perfect. Steve raised an eyebrow. Perfect? Absolutely, the audience reacted. Harold nodded confidently. We don't fight. Steve stared at him. You don't fight? No, sir. 37 years? That's right. Steve looked toward Denise. She was no longer smiling. Steve pointed at Harold. See, now you making claims your wife is standing close enough to verify. The audience laughed. Harold grinned. She knows. Steve turned toward Denise. Ma'am? Denise looked at her husband. Then at Steve. Instead of answering, she reached beneath the podium and picked up a small folded piece of paper. Harold's smile disappeared. Steve noticed immediately. Denise stepped away from the podium, walked toward Steve, and held out the note. The entire audience became quiet. Steve looked at the paper. Then at Denise. What's this? She spoke softly. Something I need you to ask him. Harold stared at her. Denise. She didn't look back. Steve took the note, slowly unfolded it, read the first line. His expression changed. Then he read it again. He looked at Harold. Harold's face had gone pale. Steve lowered the paper. Sir? Harold swallowed. Steve looked down at the note one more time, then asked, Where do you go every Thursday night? The audience went completely silent. Harold looked at his wife. Denise stared straight ahead. Steve held up the note. Your wife says you've been leaving the house every Thursday for 18 months. Harold said nothing. She says you tell her you're helping a friend. Silence. Steve stepped closer. She says she knows that isn't true. Harold looked down. Steve asked again. Where do you go every Thursday? Harold still didn't answer. And suddenly, the perfect marriage didn't look perfect anymore. To understand why Denise Bennett brought that note onto the Family Feud stage, you have to understand what Thursday nights had become inside their house. Harold and Denise met when they were both in their early 20s. He worked at an auto parts warehouse. She worked in the office of a local elementary school. They married young, bought a small house outside Memphis, had 2 daughters, built the kind of life nobody makes movies about because most of it worked. Bills, church, family cookouts, school concerts, broken washing machines, Christmas mornings, arguments about thermostat settings, 37 ordinary years. Denise would later say that was exactly what she loved about it. There had never been a dramatic betrayal, no affairs, no secret families, no disappearing bank accounts. Harold was dependable. He came home, paid bills, fixed things, remembered birthdays badly, but remembered them. When Denise's mother got sick, Harold drove her to appointments without being asked. When their youngest daughter needed money for college, Harold worked overtime. He was not a perfect husband, but he had always been present. Until 18 months before the Family Feud taping. That was when Thursdays changed. The first time, Harold told Denise, I'm going to help Raymond with something. Raymond was an old coworker. Denise didn't question it. The next Thursday, Harold left again. Same time. Around 6:30. He came back after 10. The third Thursday, The same thing happened. Denise eventually asked, "What are you helping Raymond with every week?" Harold shrugged. "Stuff around the house." "What stuff?" "Just things." She let it go. At first. Then Thursday became a ritual. Harold showered after work, changed clothes, left around 6:30, came home sometime between 10 and 11. If Denise asked questions, Harold became vague. Not angry. Vague. That bothered her more. After 37 years, Denise knew what Harold looked like when he was hiding something. He avoided eye contact. He answered too quickly. He found something to do with his hands, and every Thursday night, Harold did all three. For months, Denise told herself not to become suspicious. Then one night she called Raymond, not to investigate. At least, that's what she told herself. She asked casually, "How's that project Harold's helping you with?" Raymond went quiet. "What project?" Denise felt something cold move through her. She laughed. "Never mind. I must have misunderstood." She hung up. That Thursday, when Harold came home, she was sitting at the kitchen table. "You weren't with Raymond." Harold stopped. "What?" "I called him." Harold's face changed. Denise waited. He could have told her the truth. Instead he said, "I was with someone else." "Who?" "A friend." "Which friend?" Harold looked away. Denise's voice hardened. "Who?" He answered, "I can't tell you." That sentence changed their marriage. Not because Denise immediately assumed another woman, although the thought came. How could it not? Her husband disappeared every Thursday, lied about where he went, and now refused to name the person he was with. Denise asked the obvious question, "Are you seeing somebody?" Harold looked horrified. "No, then tell me where you are." "I can't." "Why?" "I just can't." Denise stared at him. "You expect me to accept that?" Harold said quietly, "I need you to trust me." Denise laughed. "Not because anything was funny. Trust you? You're asking me to trust the part you refuse to tell me." Harold had no answer. That was the beginning of 18 months of quiet suspicion. Denise never found lipstick, never found hotel receipts, never saw another woman's name on his phone. But every Thursday, Harold left. And every Thursday Denise sat alone. Sometimes she watched television. Sometimes she cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. Sometimes she stared at the driveway. But gradually, something inside her marriage changed. She stopped telling Harold things. If he could have one private life, maybe she could too. Not an affair, just silence. Harold would ask how her day was. Fine, he would ask what she wanted for dinner. Anything. They still slept in the same bed, still attended church, still saw their daughters, still celebrated their anniversary. From the outside, nothing looked broken. That was why Harold could stand on a television stage and tell Steve Harvey their marriage was perfect. Maybe, in his mind it was. They didn't fight. But they didn't fight because Denise had stopped asking. 3 months before the taping, the Bennett family received the Family Feud call. Their oldest daughter, Monica, had submitted the application without telling anyone. Harold was thrilled. Denise almost refused. Then her daughters got excited. Tickets were booked, vacation days arranged, and Denise decided she would go. But sometime during the trip, she made another decision. She put a small folded note inside her purse. She didn't know whether she would use it. She didn't even know exactly what she wanted Steve Harvey to do with it. She only knew that her husband had spent 18 months refusing to answer one question at home, and maybe, standing beneath television lights with nowhere to disappear, he finally would. Back on the stage, Harold was still silent. Steve looked at the note, then at Denise. "You want me to keep asking?" Denise nodded. "Yes." Harold closed his eyes. Steve's voice softened. "Sir, is there another woman?" Harold immediately looked up. "No." Denise watched him. Steve asked, "You sure?" "Yes, sir, no affair?" "Never." Steve turned toward Denise. She looked uncertain. Then Steve faced Harold again. "So why lie?" Harold rubbed his hands together. "I made a promise." "To who?" Harold hesitated. Steve waited. Finally Harold said, "A group of men." The audience murmured. Denise frowned. What men? Harold looked at her. His eyes were already filling. Steve noticed. Mr. Bennett? Harold took a breath. Then said, Thursday nights I go to a church basement. Denise stared at him. For what? Harold looked down. A support group. Steve's expression changed. Denise's face softened slightly, but confusion remained. A support group for what? Harold struggled to answer. Then Steve quietly said, Take your time. Harold nodded. For fathers who lost children. Denise stopped breathing. Their daughters went completely still. The audience became silent. Denise whispered, Harold, and suddenly everything about the previous 18 months changed. 31 years earlier, before their 2 daughters were born, Harold and Denise had a son. His name was Michael. He lived for 11 days. Most people in their lives didn't know. Some family members did. A few old friends remembered. But Harold and Denise almost never spoke his name anymore. Michael had been born premature. For 11 days they lived inside a hospital room. Then Denise went home without him. She grieved loudly. For years. Harold did not. At the funeral, he held Denise up. When she cried at night, Harold comforted her. When family members asked how he was doing, Harold gave the same answer, I'm fine. He had a wife to take care of, bills to pay, work on Monday. A few years later, Monica was born. Then Rachel. Life moved forward. And Harold packed Michael away somewhere inside himself. For 3 decades. Then 18 months earlier, Harold's friend from work lost an adult son in a motorcycle accident. Harold went to the funeral. Something happened there. Watching another father stand beside another casket broke open something Harold thought was gone. A few weeks later, that friend asked Harold to come with him to a grief support meeting. Harold refused. Then went anyway. Thursday night. He sat in the back, said nothing. The next week he returned. Then again. For months, Harold listened to men talk about sons and daughters they had lost. Some recently, some decades earlier. Eventually, Harold said Michael's name out loud, for the first time in years. And after that, Thursday nights became the only place Harold allowed himself to grieve. Steve looked at him. Why didn't you tell your wife? Harold wiped his eyes. Because it was hers too. Denise stared at him. Harold continued, She suffered enough. His voice cracked. I watched what losing Michael did to her. And I thought if I brought it back. Denise shook her head. Harold, he looked at her. You thought I forgot? Harold said nothing. You thought I didn't still think about him? I didn't want to hurt you. Denise stepped closer. You lied to me for 18 months because you didn't want to hurt me? Harold nodded. She looked at Steve. Then back at her husband. I thought you were cheating. Harold's face collapsed. I know. Denise froze. You knew? He nodded. I knew you thought that. Steve stepped back slightly. Even he looked stunned. Denise's voice rose. And you let me? Harold tried to explain. I didn't know how to tell you. You let me think there was another woman rather than tell me you were grieving our son? The audience was completely silent. Harold whispered, Yes. Denise turned away. Steve watched her. For a moment, it looked as if she might walk off. Instead, she covered her face. Her daughters moved toward her. Steve held up one hand gently. Give her a second. Denise lowered her hands, then looked at Harold. You stood here and told Steve our marriage is perfect. Harold looked ashamed. I know. It isn't. I know. You knew when you said it. Yes, why? Harold struggled, then answered, because saying anything else meant admitting something was wrong. Denise stared at him. Steve slowly nodded. There it is. Everyone looked toward Steve. Steve stepped closer to Harold. You didn't lie because you thought your marriage was perfect. Harold said nothing. You called it perfect because you were scared of what happened if you admitted it wasn't. Harold nodded. Steve looked toward Denise. And you? Denise took a long breath. I brought the note because I wanted him embarrassed. Harold looked at her. She admitted it plainly. I wanted somebody to make him answer me. Her eyes filled again. I thought I knew what the answer was. Steve asked, What did you think? Denise looked at Harold. Another woman. Harold shook his head. Never. I know that now. She stepped closer to him. But Harold, I need you to understand something. He nodded. For 18 months every Thursday night I thought you were choosing somebody else over me. Harold began crying. And the truth is somehow better and worse. He looked confused. Better because there wasn't another woman. She paused. Worse because you were carrying our son alone while I was sitting 15 feet away. Harold covered his mouth. Denise's voice broke. You didn't protect me. You left me out. That sentence hit harder than anything else. Steve looked down at the floor. Harold could barely speak. I'm sorry. Denise nodded. I know. Harold stepped toward her, then stopped. He wasn't sure whether touching her was allowed. Denise noticed. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Denise reached for his hand. The audience reacted softly. Harold took it. Steve waited. Finally he asked, "What was your son's name?" Harold looked at Denise. Denise answered, "Michael." Steve nodded. How old? 11 days. Harold squeezed Denise's hand. Steve looked at the couple, then toward their daughters. You girls know about your brother? Monica nodded through tears. Yes, Rachel said, but Dad never talks about him. Harold looked at his daughters. I didn't know how. Steve said, You know how now? Harold glanced at Denise. I'm learning. Steve picked up the folded note. He looked at it. Then at Denise. This little piece of paper did all this. The audience laughed gently. Denise smiled through tears. Steve unfolded it again. Can I read the whole thing? Denise hesitated. Then nodded. Steve read, Ask my husband where he goes every Thursday night. He has lied to me for 18 months. He says our marriage is perfect. I need him to tell the truth in front of somebody because he will not tell it to me. Steve lowered the paper. Nobody spoke. Then Harold said, She deserved the truth. Denise answered yes. Harold nodded. And I should have told you at home. Yes, I'm sorry. I know. Steve smiled slightly. See, now we getting somewhere. The audience laughed. Steve pointed at Harold. 37 years married, and you standing here telling me perfect. Harold gave a small embarrassed smile. Steve shook his head. Ain't nobody married 37 years got perfect. The audience applauded. You got survived. More laughter. You got repaired. Applause, you got forgiven. Denise nodded. You got I'm still here even though you make no sense. The audience laughed louder. Harold finally laughed too. Steve continued, That's marriage. Then his expression became serious. But what you don't get is secret pain. He looked directly at Harold. Especially when it belongs to both of you. Harold nodded. No, sir. Steve looked at Denise. And ma'am, you brought the note because you thought you were about to expose your husband. Denise gave a small smile. Yes, Steve held up the note. Instead, looks like you found him. That brought the audience to its feet. Denise started crying again. Harold wrapped his arms around her. This time she let him. Their daughters joined them. Steve turned away for a moment, giving the family space. After several seconds, he looked toward the cameras. See, this why I ask questions. The audience laughed. Then Steve pointed at Harold. Although normally I'm trying to get survey answers, not 30 years of therapy. Even Harold laughed. Eventually, they went back to the game. But everything felt different. Harold wasn't performing anymore. Neither was Denise. They laughed more, talked more. At one point, Harold leaned toward Denise before answering a question. Steve immediately stopped him. Whoa, Harold froze. Steve pointed. You asking your wife something? The audience laughed. Harold grinned. Yes, Steve looked toward the ceiling. Ladies and gentlemen, progress. Denise laughed so hard she had to lean against the podium. The Bennetts won the game. Then Harold and Denise were selected for fast money. Denise went first. She scored 112 points. A huge round. Harold came out needing 88. Steve started the clock. Name something people keep even when it hurts. Harold answered, A photograph. Good answer. Name something people wish they could get back. Time. Top answer. Name something you should never be afraid to say to your spouse. Harold stopped. The clock continued. Steve repeated, name something you should never be afraid to say to your spouse. Harold looked across the stage at Denise. The truth. The audience reacted. Steve looked at him but kept moving. Last question. Name someone you call when you're hurting. Harold answered, my wife. Time. Denise immediately covered her mouth. Steve slowly turned toward Harold. Man, Harold smiled nervously. Steve shook his head. You picked a heck of a day to become emotionally intelligent. The audience exploded. The answers were revealed. Photograph, strong, time, number 1. The truth, number 1. Harold needed 19 points on the final answer. Steve revealed, my wife. 27. They won. The family rushed onto the stage. Confetti fell. Harold hugged Denise. Steve stood beside them. Then Denise suddenly reached into her pocket. Steve noticed. Please don't have another note. The audience roared. Denise laughed. No, she held up the original folded paper. Steve smiled. What you doing with it? Denise looked at Harold. Then she tore it in half. Harold stared. Then she tore it again. And again. She placed the pieces in Harold's hand. I don't need Steve to ask you next Thursday. Harold started crying. Denise continued, I'm asking now. He nodded. What? She looked straight at him. Can I come with you? Harold froze. To the group? Yes. He looked overwhelmed. Denise squeezed his hand. Not forever. She smiled. Maybe just once. Harold nodded. Yes. Steve looked away. The audience was crying again. Harold whispered, I'd like that. Denise nodded. Good, then Harold said, and after that she waited. We go home. Yes, and talk. Denise smiled, for as long as it takes. Harold nodded. Steve looked at the audience. That right there. He pointed at the pieces of paper in Harold's hand. That's what perfect looks like. He shook his head, not having no problems. He pointed toward Harold and Denise, having somewhere safe enough to finally tell the truth about them. The audience stood. Harold pulled Denise close, and for the first time in 18 months, Thursday night no longer belonged to a secret. It belonged to both of them. People get scared. They go quiet. They hide pain because they think silence is protection. Sometimes they lie because the truth feels too heavy to hand to someone they love. Harold Bennett spent 18 months believing he was protecting his wife from an old wound. Denise spent those same 18 months believing her husband had given his heart to someone else. Both were wrong. Both were hurting. And neither knew how to cross the few feet between them. Until Denise handed Steve Harvey a folded note. She thought the note would expose a secret. Instead, it opened a door. A husband finally said his son's name. A wife finally understood where her husband had been going. And a man who called his marriage perfect finally learned something much more useful. Perfect was never the goal. Honest was. Because sometimes one piece of paper doesn't end a marriage. Sometimes it gives two people the question they should have asked each other months ago. Where are you really going? And why are you going there alone?